I'm speaking with Peter Manuel from Flag Australia, and this is in the series Take Back Your Country. I'm David Flint. And at the end of this program, I'll be going over what the purpose of Take Back Your Country is and how it can be achieved. So, Peter, I believe you have some questions for me.
Yes, I certainly have, David. Nice to talk to you again. I've got a few people that have been watching these videos and said, look, do you mind if we ask the good professor some questions? And I said, I don't think he'd mind at all. So the first one, David, is from Angelina from South Australia. And naturally, she's very concerned what's going on. And she says, what can we do, or what can be done in regards to politicians with their alleged insider trading with water, offshore bank accounts with politicians? How do they get away with this? It has to be disclosed, and it should be unlawful. And she is very, very worried about dodgy deals.
Well, Peter, very clearly, we should be fully informed about the financial interests of our politicians and their families, because this is obviously an area where they can take advantage of their office. And in addition, I would say not only should that occur, but there should be an extensive ban on their engaging in financial activities in any way relating to their public life as a politician for a number of years. I know that the president, for example, President Trump, promised that he would impose a very long-term requirement in this regard to ensure that there wasn't the sort of abuse. One of the problems you get, not only a lot of these things kept secret. For example, we don't have a proper register of water ownership. When they introduced the separate ownership of water, they didn't require a register of all that water, which of course they should have. So we would know who owns the water, and of course it should be transparent, and we shouldn't be blocked by, for example, trusts and other instruments in tax avoidance jurisdictions. Now, to achieve that, you do need special legislation to achieve that. The politicians are very reluctant to introduce that sort of legislation. And this really relates to something that I'll talk about at the end, and that is the need to empower the rank and file Australian to take a greater part in the government of Australia, and in particular to control our politicians. So I shall come back to that. Angela.
Very good, David. The next question is from Marita in Victoria. And Marita thinks the world of you, David, like a lot of these people that are asking me to ask you these questions. And Marita has got here very short, pardon? Marita has got here, is Andrews breaching the Constitution? She said the anxiety and suicides in Victoria are unbelievable. And poor Marita, she is absolutely beside herself, her family and her friends. They're not in a good situation at all. They're really not.
I think that a lot of the activities being taken by the National Cabinet, and in particular in Victoria, are probably not lawful in that they're done under what's called subordinate legislation. There's an Act of Parliament, and then under that Act of Parliament, a minister or some public officer is authorised to take certain action, make regulations, and so on. And I think that a lot of that is too extensive and beyond what the Parliament intended. So there, I think there is a degree of illegality, but somebody would have to try to enforce it. And going to court is expensive and takes a long time. There's been a very interesting case recently concerning the ban on the live cattle export. That was under the Gillard government, and they instituted a ban, a quite proper ban, which was the cattle export to abattoirs in Indonesia, which were not behaving properly, which were adopting cruel practices. But they also knew there were other ones which were perfectly proper, as good as Australian abattoirs, where the cattle should have been sent. But suddenly decided to institute a ban on all of them. And the court found that this was too extensive. He had no power under the legislation. Parliament could not have been assumed to take away people's common law right to carry on business. So I think there is some protection in the law, not so much in the Constitution, but in the common law. There are aspects of the Constitution which I think some of the premiers have breached, particularly in relation to the borders. But I think we do need to take action to try to empower the people of Australia so that we can control the politicians more, so that next time, in the next pandemic, there will be greater control and greater control now. But that will require the Australian people to demand change. And I'll come back to that later on. So it is a terrible situation, and I agree with you entirely.
David, this is Rose from South Australia. She's asked me to ask you, given the turmoil, deceit and abuse of power of federal and state governments, is there a remedy available to Australians to have all sitting parliamentarians stood down?
Well, Rose, unfortunately there isn't, but there should be. We should be able to say to the politicians, look, you're not performing, you've got to go. And that applies to most of us. We have a rule in most business, in most employment, in all sorts of activities, that if you don't perform, you eventually have to go. Sometimes this is slowed down by various courts, but eventually you do have to perform. And the politicians also have to perform. And I think that this is something which should be introduced into Australia. And I believe there's a way to do that. It is done in other countries, but it does require the Australian people to stand up and to demand this be given to them. Peter.
And this is the last one for tonight, David Carroll from Queensland. How do we get these traitors in our government out constitutionally? We need to be self-sufficient again, and what she means, food production, manufacturing, industry, the whole lot, especially now with what's happened with this Chinese virus out of Wuhan. So, most of these questions in regards to basically what we're trying to do with Australians take back your country, which you might explain to us now, David.
Well, Carol, as you know, we can't recall governments, but I think there is a way. And I think if we reflect on how this country was formed, we will see how our ancestors achieved something which the politicians weren't achieving. And that was in the early 1890s. There'd been a convention, a draft constitution had been developed, but then it was sent back to the 6 colonies. They weren't states then, they were still self-governing colonies. When it went back to the colonies, the politicians fell amongst themselves and then wouldn't agree. There was no chance of this country ever federating, ever forming one country. We would be 6 countries now if it had been left to the politicians. But fortunately, there was a conference in the early 1890s, a People's Conference, and a man there, Sir John Quick, towards the end of the conference. This was at Corowa on the border of New South Wales and Victoria. They were particularly offended and affected by the fact that New South Wales and Victoria, for example, had tariffs between them. Trade was difficult between them. And being one country seemed to be a better solution. And other people were also concerned about the world situation, that as 6 colonies, we would find it difficult to defend ourselves. There'd be much more chances of defending ourselves with British help if if we could be united into one country with one navy and one army and so on. And what Sir John Quick, he wasn't a knight then, he was knighted later, what John Quick did, he proposed at that conference that the next convention be directly elected by the people rather than appointed by the politicians. But more importantly, when the convention came to its conclusions and consulted widely and developed a draft after a lot of discussion with the people generally and with the politicians, once they came to their final conclusion as to what the Constitution should be. Remember, this Constitution wasn't so much about protecting rights, it was really working out the terms of the compact between the 6 colonies. They would put it to the people. It was agreed that without any change by the state parliaments, they called them colonial parliaments then, it would be put to the people of each state. And that happened. There were referendums in each state except Western Australia. They were a bit slow in getting to this in the first round. New South Wales didn't reach the majority which was required under its legislation. Further negotiations took place, and a lot of the problems that New South Wales had was satisfied. So the referendums were put again, passed in all states, a bit late again in Western Australia. That came a bit later. So the people of Australia agreed on the formation of this country. In those days, it then had to be taken to London and was put through the British Parliament quite quickly. But remember, there was no jet travel. They had to go to London by boat. They had to. There were no faxes, no computers, no emails. So it took longer. They got it through the British Parliament. Then it had to wait until the West Australians had their referendum. The Queen Victoria, not Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria was authorised to pass it. And there she was, waiting at Balmoral for a message to come from Perth. Little old lady, at the end of her life, waiting, and eventually the message came from Perth. The people of Western Australia had agreed to join. So she was able to, by royal proclamation, set up a federal Commonwealth of Australia, uniting the people of the 6 colonies, including Western Australia, to take effect on the first day of the new year and the new century, the 1st of January 1901. It was a really momentous moment. The extraordinary thing is that all that, from the beginning of the election, the convention, to getting it through and having the proclamation passed, all that was done in less than 4 years. You can't build a dam in 4 years in Australia today. You can't lay down tram tracks. 19th century technology down the main street of Sydney, it took about 5 or 6 years to do that in Sydney recently. Something was terribly wrong. And I often ask people, are you aware of a significant problem in Australia? If it were not caused by the politicians, it has been made significantly worse by them. People look at one another and they can't think of anything. They say, well, what about the bushfires? The bushfires have been made worse, particularly the last ones in New South Wales, by the politicians ordering that the forests not be managed properly. So you've got this collection of years and years of dead leaves and dead trees and bushes underneath the canopy, which means if you have a fire, it turns into a massive bushfire. And that's what we had in New South Wales. The politicians create most of the problems we have in Australia. So what we are proposing is not another political party, just a movement. And there's a petition about this. And what we're saying is we should do what our ancestors did at Corriwa. We should have a second Corriwa plan. What that Corowa plan should be is that a convention, we haven't had a general convention to review the Constitution in 120 years. It's time to be reviewed because there are weaknesses. The High Court has done terrible things to the Constitution in interpreting it. Not as bad as the American Supreme Court, but certainly they've twisted the meaning of the Constitution in a way that people never intended. All of this should be looked at again. And we think a convention should be elected. The politicians will only agree to that if there's enormous pressure. So we have a petition. The link will appear in the text below. But we think that if there is such a convention called, this group should be one of the groups contesting the convention. What we do argue about the convention, the delegates shouldn't be paid. It shouldn't be seen as a way to make money. It shouldn't be paid. And with modern methods of communication, it wouldn't require vast numbers of meetings. A lot of the work could be done by committees meeting by phone and by Zoom and so on. And what we say is that that constitution, the Constitution of Australia, should be reformed to make the politicians accountable 24/7. We call it the 5 R's. And we say, first, we should return to the Federation. The judges have taken away a lot of the principles of the Federation. A lot of the powers have been taken by Canberra, which they shouldn't be. For example, the Australian Federation is the federation in the world which is the most concentrated from a taxation point of view. Canberra takes 80%. No other federation does this. 80% of the taxes, hands back half to the states, but tells them how to spend it. So return to the federal principles, including those that were changed without the people agreeing in referendums. Reduce, the second R is reduce taxes, reduce regulations, and remove centralisation. There's too much centralisation in some of the state capitals, especially Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. They take up too much of the state. There should be more states. North Queensland, for example, people of North Queensland should, if they wish, be allowed to form a separate state. People of New England and New South Wales the same. Because it's better to have, and the pandemic showed this, it's better not to have rules made in Sydney, which then apply in every part of New South Wales. It's better for those areas of the state to make their own rules. So that was the second R. The third one was to reform the political parties. The political parties are the most concentrated, the most under the control of power brokers, the most inclined to take away the power of the members of the parties. What we've said is reform the political parties, tell them that if they want to get the enormous amount of money that they get from voting, they get $2 something for each primary vote after a certain amount. They get exemptions from all sorts of legislation, privacy, electoral and so on, their names on the ballot papers. In return for that, they should have to be always open, transparent and democratic. And the next R was we thought that we should have the power of return, the power of recall. Citizens should, by signing a petition, a certain percentage of the electorate should be allowed to sign a petition and recall a specific member of parliament or all of the parliament to a new election. I would have thought that that would have been very popular in New South Wales a few years ago, so much so that the opposition promised to look at recall elections. They looked at it, but they didn't introduce it. It's sitting in, the report is sitting in a dusty filing cabinet. Recall elections, they might not be used often. They exist in a number of American states, but the power hangs like a sword of Damocles over the head of every politician. They know that if they push things too far, the people can always recall them. The final R was referendums. We think that there should be, as in Switzerland, citizen-initiated referendums. You should be able to, by petition, a certain percentage, sign a petition calling for the repeal of legislation, the denouncing of treaties, or the introduction of new legislation via petition with a certain percentage of the people, and then a referendum on that. And that would give an important power. It's done in Switzerland. People say, oh, people wouldn't like that. If you have voluntary voting, people like it. In Switzerland, every 3 months, I hope I don't frighten you by this, every 3 months in Switzerland, there's an opportunity to vote. Most of it is done by controlled mail voting, very carefully controlled, so that there's a minimal amount of fraud, unlike Australia. And there are people who raise questions in the local area, the local municipality or shire. They raise it in the state, and they also raise it nationally. And all of those are voted on. For example, there was a notorious one a few years ago. I shouldn't say notorious, it was famous. And that was people were sick of mosques being built in little Swiss towns by immigrants with enormous towers. And that really jarred against the architecture of a beautiful little Swiss village. And a referendum was put to the people. There's a lot of objection to it. How can you stop the building of these towers to mosques in Switzerland? It was passed overwhelmingly, and now in Switzerland you can't do that in Switzerland. All sorts of interesting things that people can do. I think it's very important. Alan Jones talks about the pub test. Does something pass the pub test? That just means common sense. Too much of what politicians do does not pass the pub test. It goes against common sense. And the way to deal with that is to make the people much more powerful. It's called direct democracy. Give them a degree of direct democracy, which allows the people. Now, the only way we'll get this is through a convention. The only way we'll get a convention is by an enormous movement in Australia, not a political party, a movement of people saying, we want a convention. And then some politicians will agree with that. Some newspapers and media will agree with that. And it will be seen when you look, for example, at the Swiss model, that this is a way to control the models and to make sure decisions are made with common sense, rather than the silly decisions we're getting. For example, the buying of submarines, nuclear submarines, stripping their nuclear parts out and putting in obsolete forms of transport, having them delivered many decades away, as though that's going to help the defence of Australia, and spending hundreds of billions of dollars on that. We had in Sydney, we've got a second airport which we don't need. The Sydney airport is big enough, takes enough planes, and if the politicians and the bureaucrats didn't fly around as much as they do for travelling, there wouldn't be as much travel from Sydney airport. They're building a second airport. It's just been revealed by the audit office that the land for the next to the second airport, which they needed, was worth $3 million. And the government, the Turnbull government, paid to a supporter of the party $30 million. 3 million, 30 million. There's a lot of this going on. And this has to be cleaned out. The only way to clean this out is to give the people more power. So there's a petition down there, and I invite you to have a look at that petition. And if you agree with that, sign it. Not a political movement. It's a movement for the reform, the review and the reform of the Constitution of Australia to increase the participation, role and control of the people of Australia. Peter.
Yes, very good, David. That comes back to Angelina from South Australia's question when she talks about dodgy deals with what happened with that bit of land going for 30 million and it was only valued at 3. David, I think you mentioned a couple of very important things there. We're not being paid to do this. This is all voluntary. So we're doing this because we care, and we're worried about the way this country is heading. And I think the people will respect what we're about on this. And the only way we're going to make this happen is that, as what you've said, is for the people to come on board. It's a people's movement. Now, we don't have to do this. We've got enough on our plate. You have, I have, but this country is in such a mess. Something's got to happen. And if we had recall elections at the moment, I'm sure that Palaszczuk and Daniel Andrews would be gone now. Yes. So please, people, come on board with this. The professor has got a solution here. And I just want to thank you very, very much, David, because people are just so worried about the way this country is headed that now they can see a solution. But it's up to the people now to come on board and sign this petition, and we might be able to do something. We might be able to get our country back.
Yes.
David.
And we're also, all of us, those watching and us, we're thinking of the next generations, the generations yet to come. We have to leave in Australia, the Australia that, for example, my generation found, and the previous generation fought to protect from invasion. And it's wrong that we would leave to the young people of Australia the mess that the politicians have made of this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Much appreciated.